You left New York for Berlin in Lederhosen.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I didn't leave in Lederhosen. I came back in Lederhosen. I don't know. I was for one, I'd met a guy, and I'm still with him now. He lives in New York now, but he lived in Berlin at the time, so I went to spend time with him. And then on the other hand, I don't know. I wanted some kind of intense experience, and I think Berlin is famous for that. I was expecting a very different experience. I was expecting this kind of, very brutal, minimalistic or kind of edgy, cutting edge, underground thing with synthesizers and smashing bottles or whatever. But when I arrived, I actually was faced with a whole other experience, which was Lederhosen and Sans Souci and Wagner and Goethe and going to Bayreuth and reading, Schiller and all these kind of... It's just this massive wave of German Romanticism totally took over, and it was pretty amazing because I wasn't expecting that to happen. But in retrospect, it was very, very foreseeable because I'm such a romantic at heart, and with the love of opera, I mean, you can't help but, if you go to Germany, but be impressed by just the it's where music really comes from. And some would argue, I mean, classical music. The classical music is like their folk music, so it's still it's very fascinating to me.
What was it in German Romanticism? What really?
Well, what's great about German Romanticism is that on one hand, it's very kind of lyrical and very sensitive and intense and sort of sad or whatever, but it's also really tough. I mean, the Germans are really tough, and as we all know, and they're very, and it sort of balances between this kind of incredibly refined nature and this really brutal sort of view of life, so it kind of has both sides to it, and it's also very, very on one hand, it's very intellectual, but also very emotional, But also, so it's both, It's. I mean, I believe this strongly, but I think Germany is really the home of the best things in the world and the worst things in the world. It's extreme, It's either awful or wonderful. So it's that kind of place.
Did you find something in the German Romanticism, even though it's a quite broad subject, but you think that we can learn?
I was very. I mean, this isn't really Romanticism. This is earlier than Romanticism. But I was very influenced by Frederick the Great, and when I went to Sans Souci, and when I, read about him and how he was, the first monarch to really encourage the arts and to build. He built the first ever public theater that wasn't attached to a palace. Was built by him, and he was this flute player and wrote poetry, and he was probably gay, and he hung out with Voltaire and stuff, and he seemed like an interesting character, and then also, I was also heavily influenced by Wagner. My boyfriend at the time was working for the Staatsoper in Berlin, and we went to see several Wagner operas, and then we went to...
Have you seen The Ring?
I've seen parts of The Ring. I mean, I've seen it all on video, but we also went to Bayreuth, and we went to see Parsifal there, and it was an amazing experience, because at the time, my mother was ill in the hospital, and seeing Parsifal was... I mean, it was just earth-shattering, just the relationship between, just that opera and what was going on in my life. It was very moving, because in the opera there's this whole, there's this desire for death. There's this kind of death. There's one character, Kundry, who's been waiting to die for like 1,000 years or whatever, and she can't die, and it wants peace, and it kind of treats death as this beautiful thing, and is okay, and when my mother was sick, I had to think sometimes in those terms, like, oh my God, like maybe this is going to happen, and maybe death is a beautiful thing, and maybe, there is, it is more about love and everything. So it was very intense, but good.